Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping back in time to unpack one of the most dramatic, tense, and absolutely consequential chapters in global history. We're talking about the Boxer Rebellion. Now, to help us visualize this incredibly complex clash of empires, we're using a completely unique visual style today: animated macaroni noodle art. I know, it sounds a little quirky at first, but stick with me here. You are going to see how brilliantly this medium actually maps out the shifting borders, the sheer numbers, and the really intense history of what happened at the dawn of the 20th century, and more importantly, why it still matters so much to our world today in 2026.
Okay, let's dive into this. Support the Qing, destroy the foreigner. This wasn't just some catchy political slogan. It was the absolute beating heart of a deeply mystical nationalism that completely erupted in China right around the year 1900. To truly understand why every day, normal people would suddenly take up arms and chant these words, we really have to look at what they were experiencing on the ground. We have to look at the immense, boiling pressure cooking within the country at that time.
So, picture this. By the late 1800s, China's ruling Qing dynasty is basically crumbling. Foreign powers, specifically Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia, had literally carved the country up into these distinct spheres of influence. They were extracting wealth, controlling the trade routes, and essentially treating huge parts of China as their own personal property. As you can see mapped out here, this aggressive carve-up became the foundation of what is known historically as the Century of Humiliation.
But listen, the geopolitics? That was only half the story. Up in the northern provinces, the local populations were being absolutely ravaged by severe droughts and famine. People were literally starving to death. And well, when people suffer like that, they look for a scapegoat, right? The locals pointed their fingers directly at the foreign devils. And this wasn't just some vague general hatred, it was hyper-specific. They blamed Christian missionaries, and they deeply feared the new technology these foreigners were bringing in, things like railroads and telegraph lines. Why? Because to them, these strange new iron tracks and wires were actively disrupting the feng shui of the land. They believed this tech was angering the spirits and directly causing the devastating droughts.
Out of all this intense desperation and anger, a group called the Yihai Tuan emerged. Translated, that means the militia united in righteousness. To Westerners, though, they became known simply as the Boxers. This was because the group practiced these really distinct martial arts and calisthenics, which our noodle artists enthusiastically bringing to life right now. But we have to understand, these weren't just everyday physical exercises for them. They were deeply spiritual practices meant to prepare their bodies and minds for a literal holy war.
Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is that this entire movement was fueled by a mystical sort of nationalism. The Boxers genuinely believed that by performing specific rituals and casting spells, they could become entirely invulnerable to Western bullets. Let that sink in. They thought their spirits were literally stronger than lead. But tragically, they were on a collision course with harsh reality. It was an ideology of magic clashing head-on with the cold steel and modern military firepower of the Industrial Revolution. Initially, the Qing government actually tried to suppress the Boxers, but then the political wind shifted, entirely thanks to Empress Dowager Cixi. She was incredibly shrewd. She looked at this rising tide of Boxers and didn't see a threat to her rule. She saw a golden opportunity to finally kick out the foreigners who'd been humiliating her empire for decades. So she executed this massive opportunistic pivot. She officially sided with the rebels and boldly declared war on all foreign powers. And that declaration led straight into 55 agonizing days. In June of 1900, the Boxers, now fully backed by the Imperial Army, descended on Beijing. They managed to trap foreign diplomats, their families, and thousands of Chinese Christians inside the legation quarter. And amazingly, this small group held out against overwhelming numbers. Notice how our macaroni visual style shifts here into these really intricate, claustrophobic mosaics. It perfectly captures the gritty, desperate defense of this 2-month siege, a standoff that quickly became an absolute legend in Western military history.
But amid all the high-level geopolitics, it is absolutely vital we don't look past the immense tragedy that occurred outside those legation walls. The Boxers specifically targeted those they called secondary devils, which was their derogatory term for Chinese converts to Christianity. Tens of thousands of these Chinese Christians were mercilessly massacred during the uprising. It's just a massive, tragic loss of life that honestly gets forgotten a lot in the broader historical summaries of the rebellion. And its legacy? It remains a deeply sensitive point for the church in China even today.
Well, news of the siege finally reached the outside world, and it triggered an astonishing military response from a completely unprecedented coalition. Get a load of this lineup:
The UK, the US, Japan, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. 8 rival nations that were very often at each other's throats, literally putting aside their differences to form a massive coalition army to invade China and break the siege.
The alliance was ultimately successful in lifting the siege, but what followed was just devastating. The alliance forces didn't just liberate the trapped diplomats and pack up. They brought down a hammer. They engaged in a brutal, systematic campaign across Beijing and the surrounding countryside. This wasn't just a simple military victory. It turned into an era of unchecked looting and mass executions. The historical record is crystal clear here. The retaliation by the alliance was sweeping, and it was merciless.
So the crucial point is, following all that military devastation came a profoundly humiliating diplomatic punishment, the Boxer Protocol of 1901. It was explicitly designed to bankrupt China. It demanded a massive indemnity of 450 million taels of silver. To put that into perspective for us today, that is roughly $10 billion. And perhaps even worse than the financial ruin, China was forced to concede their sovereignty, allowing foreign troops to be stationed permanently right there in their capital.
The impact of this was absolute. The 1-2 punch of the 1900 siege and the crushing 1901 protocol was the final, fatal blow to the Qing dynasty. It proved to the Chinese people once and for all that their government was utterly incapable of either protecting the nation from outsiders or reforming itself from within. This glaring weakness set the stage directly for the 1911 revolution, which, amazingly, brought a complete end to 2,000 years of imperial rule in China.
Now, history isn't just about memorizing what happened in the past. It's about understanding how it actively shapes our present. Let's move to and see how this builds into our modern era. The year is 2026, and the legacy of 1900 is far, far from forgotten. In fact, it is absolutely foundational to understanding our modern global landscape.
Today, we really see 2 dominant global perspectives on the Boxer Rebellion. From the Chinese view, the rebellion is taught as a pivotal, agonizing chapter of that century of humiliation. In modern geopolitical framing, the very memory of foreign armies invading and dictating terms is used as the ultimate justification for maintaining a strong, centralized military. The logic there is clear: never again will China be bullied by foreign coalitions. Conversely, the Western historical view looks back at the Boxers through a slightly different lens. Historians today tend to see the Boxers as an early, violent example of a populist backlash. It was a visceral reaction by everyday people against globalization, against foreign cultural encroachment, and against extreme economic disruption. And you know, those are themes that feel remarkably familiar in the political climate of 2026.
The Boxers truly believed their spirits were stronger than lead, and while they were tragically wrong about the bullets, history shows us they were kind of right about the spirit. Their rebellion was the very first roar of a Chinese nationalism that would eventually change the entire world. So as we look at the rising global tensions of 2026, we are left with a really critical question to ponder. When a culture feels completely backed into a corner, is a Boxer response inevitable? Or can we actually find a way to talk before the fists start flying? Think on that, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.